The night always feels longer when your mind refuses to let go. You lie awake staring at the ceiling, replaying a conversation that ended hours ago. Every sentence sounds different now. Every silence feels heavier. You wonder if you should have spoken differently, stayed longer, left sooner, loved harder. The room is quiet, yet your thoughts are louder than ever. Somewhere between midnight and morning, a single question begins circling your mind like a bird that cannot find a place to land. Why did this happen? It's a question every human being asks sooner or later. Sometimes after losing someone they loved. Sometimes after watching years of hard work disappear in a single afternoon. Sometimes after receiving news that changes the entire direction of their life without warning. People around you often respond with the same comforting phrase. Everything happens for a reason. For a brief moment, those words can feel like a warm blanket. They promise that somewhere beyond your pain, an invisible plan is quietly unfolding. But as the days pass, that sentence begins to feel strangely incomplete. Because when you're standing inside heartbreak, reasons don't appear like sunlight breaking through the clouds. Instead, you're left with confusion, anger, regret, and an unsettling silence that refuses to explain itself. Yet something unexpected often happens with time, months later, sometimes years later. You look back at the very experience that once shattered you, and you realize it became the beginning of a completely different life. Not a better life in every way. Not a life without pain. But a life you never could have imagined while you were living through the darkness. That realization raises an even deeper question. Was there really a reason all along? Or did your mind simply create one because human beings cannot bear the thought that life might be unpredictable? For thousands of years, philosophers, monks, psychologists, and historians have wrestled with this mystery. And in our modern world, where artificial intelligence predicts our behavior, social media shapes our emotions, and technology knows our habits almost better than we do, that ancient question feels more important than ever. Perhaps the answer isn't hidden in fate. Perhaps it's hidden in the way consciousness itself works. Yuval Noah Harari has spent years exploring one remarkable idea. Unlike other animals, humans don't simply react to reality. We construct stories about reality. Those stories become civilizations, religions, economies, and identities. Entire nations exist because millions of strangers collectively believe in shared narratives. Money only works because people agree that pieces of paper or digital numbers represent value. Companies survive because people trust invisible agreements and symbols. In many ways, humanity's greatest strength has never been intelligence alone. It has been imagination, the ability to create meaning where none physically exists. Long before modern science began describing this process, Buddhist philosophy had already arrived at a similar observation, though from an entirely different direction. It suggested that the greatest story any human being believes is the story of themselves. Not your name, not your profession, not your social status, but the quiet voice inside your mind that constantly whispers, "This is who I am." At first, that sounds almost impossible to accept. After all, you've been yourself your entire life. Who else could you possibly be? But pause for a moment. Think about the child you once were. The fears that once kept you awake probably seem almost amusing today. The dreams that felt impossible at 10 years old may not even matter anymore. Your favorite songs changed. Your opinions changed. Your friendships changed. Your body has replaced nearly every cell it once had. Even your memories have shifted, becoming softer in some places and sharper in others. So what exactly has remained the same? The answer feels obvious. I have. But Buddhism gently asks another question. Have you? Or has your mind simply woven thousands of changing experiences into a single story that feels continuous? That idea can feel uncomfortable, because we spend our entire lives protecting an identity we assume is permanent. We defend our opinions as though they define us. We fear failure because we believe it says something lasting about who we are. We cling to success because we secretly hope it will become permanent. Yet history keeps reminding us that permanence has always been an illusion. Ancient Egypt built pyramids believing they would preserve power forever. The Roman Empire considered itself the center of the civilized world. Kings believed their bloodlines were chosen by destiny. Entire civilizations once looked unshakable. Today, many survive only as ruins visited by tourists carrying cameras. What happened to all that certainty? Time happened. The same force that quietly transforms civilizations also transforms individual lives. The person you were 5 years ago no longer exists in quite the same way. Neither does the version of you who will exist 5 years from now. Everything is already changing. Not eventually. Right now. This simple observation became one of Buddhism's deepest teachings. Impermanence. Not as a depressing truth, but as the very nature of reality. Ironically, modern neuroscience has begun describing the brain in ways that sound surprisingly similar. Most people imagine memory as a giant library filled with perfectly preserved experiences. Whenever you remember your childhood or your first love, you assume you're pulling an untouched file from storage. But that's not what actually happens. Your brain rebuilds memories every time you recall them. Each recollection is less like watching a recording and more like reconstructing a painting from scattered pieces. Small details change. Emotions influence the story. New experiences reshape old interpretations. In other words, your memories are alive. They're constantly evolving. Have you ever argued with a family member about something both of you experienced together? You're both absolutely convinced you're remembering it correctly. Yet the stories don't match. One remembers kindness. The other remembers criticism. One recalls laughter. The other recalls embarrassment. Neither person is necessarily lying. Their minds simply rebuilt the same event through different emotional lenses. This reveals something profound. The life you remember is not exactly the life you lived. It's the life your mind continues creating. And if your past is continually being rewritten inside your own consciousness, then perhaps your suffering isn't as fixed as it appears either. The human brain has one remarkable habit. It mistakes temporary emotions for permanent realities. After heartbreak, it whispers, "You'll never love again." After failure, it insists, "This is who you are." After rejection, it quietly convinces you that you were never enough to begin with. Those thoughts feel incredibly convincing because they arrive wearing the disguise of truth. But they're predictions, not prophecies. Your brain evolved to protect you from danger. It constantly scans for threats, searching for patterns that might keep you alive. Thousands of years ago, this ability helped our ancestors survive predators and harsh environments. Today, the predators are often invisible. Fear of failure, fear of loneliness, fear of judgment, fear of becoming insignificant. Your brain responds to many of these emotional threats almost as seriously as it once responded to physical danger. That's why anxiety feels so real. That's why embarrassment can make your heart race. That's why uncertainty feels almost unbearable. The mind believes it's preparing you for survival, yet many times, it's trapping you inside possibilities that never arrive. Buddhist monks observed this long before brain scanners ever existed. They noticed that suffering rarely comes from the event itself alone. It grows from the stories we attach to the event. Two people can lose the same job. One experiences humiliation. The other experiences unexpected freedom. Two relationships can end under nearly identical circumstances. One person spends decades believing they were impossible to love. Another eventually realizes they had been living a life that no longer reflected who they had become. The event remains the same. The meaning changes everything. And perhaps that's where the phrase, "everything happens for a reason," begins to transform. Maybe the reason isn't hidden somewhere in the universe, waiting to be discovered. Maybe the reason begins the moment you decide what this experience will mean for the rest of your life. Because while you cannot always choose what happens to you, you slowly become the author of what happens within you. And that quiet difference has shaped the destiny of every human being who has ever learned to walk through suffering without allowing suffering to become their identity. There is a reason that realization feels so difficult to accept. Deep inside every human mind lives an invisible promise. It tells us that if we work hard enough, love deeply enough, make the right choices, and avoid enough mistakes, life will eventually become stable. We imagine a future where uncertainty finally disappears. A place where nothing important can be taken away from us. But life has never made that promise, not to emperors, not to philosophers, not to monks, not to you. For thousands of years, civilizations have searched for permanence in different forms. Some sought it through power, others through wealth, religion, legacy, or family. Every generation believed it had found the answer that would finally protect it from chaos. Yet history keeps repeating the same lesson. The strongest kingdoms collapse. The most celebrated leaders fade into forgotten pages. Cities disappear beneath deserts. Entire cultures become archaeological discoveries. The strange thing isn't that these civilizations disappeared. The strange thing is how certain they were that they wouldn't. Human beings have always confused familiarity with permanence. If something has existed for our entire lifetime, we unconsciously assume it will continue forever, until one day it doesn't. The same illusion quietly shapes our personal lives. We assume our parents will always answer the phone. We assume our closest friends will always be there. We assume our health belongs to us. We assume tomorrow will look a lot like today. Then life interrupts, not out of cruelty, simply because change has always been woven into the fabric of existence. Marcus Aurelius, writing nearly 2,000 years ago while leading the most powerful empire on earth, constantly reminded himself of this truth. Despite commanding armies and ruling millions of people, he filled his private journal with reflections about impermanence. He understood something that modern society often forgets. Power cannot negotiate with time, neither can success, neither can youth. Everything borrowed from life is eventually returned. At first glance, that sounds almost depressing. But notice what happens when you stop resisting it. A sunset becomes more beautiful because it lasts only a few minutes. A child's laughter feels precious because childhood disappears so quickly. Even the ordinary moments, sharing dinner with someone you love, driving home after work, sitting quietly beside another person without speaking, carry a kind of sacredness, precisely because they cannot be repeated forever. Impermanence doesn't rob life of meaning, it gives life meaning. Without endings, beginnings would lose their significance. Without change, growth would become impossible. Without uncertainty, courage would never exist. This is where Buddhist wisdom quietly separates itself from blind optimism. It never tells you that suffering is good. It tells you that suffering is unavoidable. The question is whether suffering becomes your prison or your teacher. Modern psychology has reached a remarkably similar conclusion. Researchers studying resilience discovered something fascinating. The people who recover most successfully from adversity are rarely those who avoid emotional pain. Instead, they are the people who eventually change the story they tell about that pain. Not the facts, the meaning. There's an enormous difference between saying, "This ruined my life," and saying, "This changed my life." The event may be identical, but the future created by those two interpretations couldn't be more different. Have you ever noticed that some people seem permanently trapped inside something that happened 20 years ago? A betrayal, a divorce, a failed business, a painful childhood. It's as if time moved forward for everyone except them. Meanwhile, someone else experiences an equally devastating loss and somehow emerges with more compassion, more wisdom, and a quieter strength than they possessed before. Why? The answer isn't intelligence. It isn't luck. And it certainly isn't that one person suffered less. The difference often lies in identity. One person begins to believe, "This is what happened to me." The other begins to believe, "This is what happened, but it isn't all that I am." That distinction is subtle, yet it changes the direction of an entire life. Carl Jung believed that much of our suffering comes from the parts of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge. We spend years building an identity that appears strong, confident, successful, or independent. Anything that threatens that image is pushed away into what he called the shadow. But the shadow never disappears. It waits. Sometimes it reveals itself through anxiety. Sometimes through anger. Sometimes through the quiet feeling that something inside you has been ignored for far too long. Buddhism approaches this mystery from another angle. Instead of asking you to destroy your shadow, it invites you to observe it. Notice the anger. Notice the fear. Notice the jealousy. Notice the loneliness. Not as enemies. Not as proof that you're broken. Simply as experiences moving through awareness. That sounds almost too simple until you actually try it. Sit quietly for just a few minutes without reaching for your phone. Turning on music or distracting yourself. Almost immediately, your mind begins performing. It starts planning tomorrow, replaying yesterday, judging yourself, comparing your life with someone else's, creating imaginary conversations that will probably never happen, predicting disasters that may never arrive. It's astonishing. Even when nothing is happening outside of you, your inner world refuses to become still. Neuroscientists have spent years studying this phenomenon. They discovered that much of the brain's activity is devoted not to experiencing the present moment, but to constructing mental simulations of the past and future. In other words, your brain is an extraordinary storyteller. Its stories can save your life. They can also quietly steal it, because the mind rarely announces that it's telling a story. It simply presents one. This person doesn't respect you. You'll fail. You've wasted your life. They're happier than you. You're falling behind. Each thought arrives dressed as reality. And if enough of those thoughts repeat long enough, they begin to feel like your identity. This is where one of Buddhism's most revolutionary insights appears. You are not every thought that enters your mind. You are the awareness capable of noticing those thoughts. At first, the distinction seems almost invisible. Then one day, something changes. You catch yourself in the middle of worry. Instead of becoming the worry, you notice it. Instead of drowning inside fear, you observe fear rising like a wave before slowly falling again. Nothing external has changed, but internally, everything begins to shift. It's like standing on the shore instead of being tossed endlessly by the ocean. The waves are still there. But now you know they are waves, not the entire sea. Modern life makes this awareness increasingly difficult. Never before have human beings been surrounded by so many voices competing for their attention. Every notification whispers that something else deserves your focus. Every advertisement quietly suggests that happiness is only one purchase away. Every social media feed presents carefully edited fragments of other people's lives, inviting endless comparison. The result is subtle but profound. We become strangers to our own minds. Instead of observing our thoughts, we outsource them. Algorithms learn what keeps us angry, what keeps us scrolling, what keeps us buying, what keeps us emotionally engaged. Yuval Noah Harari has warned that as technology becomes better at understanding human behavior, the greatest battle of the future may not be fought over land or money. It may be fought over attention, because whoever shapes your attention gradually shapes your reality. Think about that for a moment. If your attention is constantly directed outward, when do you actually meet yourself? Not the version performing for other people, not the identity you've built through career, status, or achievement. The quieter self beneath all of it. The one that exists before comparison begins. Perhaps that's why silence feels so uncomfortable today. Not because silence is empty. Because silence introduces you to the person you've been avoiding. And maybe that's exactly where freedom begins. Freedom is rarely loud. It doesn't arrive with fireworks or life-changing announcements. More often, it enters quietly, almost unnoticed. In the smallest moments, the moment you stop trying to win an argument that no longer matters, the moment you forgive someone who may never apologize, the moment you realize you've spent years chasing an image of success that was never truly yours. From the outside, nothing appears different. Inside, an entire world has shifted. This is why Buddhism places so much emphasis on awareness rather than control. Most of us spend our lives trying to control the world around us. We try to control other people's opinions, protect ourselves from disappointment, predict the future, and avoid uncertainty. We convince ourselves that if we can just organize life well enough, happiness will finally become permanent. But every attempt at total control creates a new fear. If you build your identity around success, you become terrified of failure. If you build it around relationships, you begin fearing loss. If you build it around reputation, every criticism feels like an attack on your existence. The tighter you hold life, the more frightened you become of losing it. Have you ever noticed how exhausting that is? Even during moments that should bring joy, a small voice whispers, "What if this doesn't last?" You're celebrating a promotion, already worrying about keeping your position. You're falling in love, already fearing heartbreak. You're watching your children grow, already grieving how quickly time is passing. It's almost as if the mind struggles to experience happiness without simultaneously preparing for its disappearance. Yet strangely, trying to prevent future pain often steals today's peace. The Stoic philosophers understood this paradox. So did Buddhist monks. Although the traditions developed thousands of miles apart, they both arrived at a remarkably similar insight. You cannot possess life, you can only participate in it. There's a quiet humility in that realization. The people you love are not possessions. Your accomplishments are not permanent trophies. Even your own body is something you borrow for a while. Everything you cherish is temporary. At first, that thought feels heartbreaking. Then something unexpected happens. Gratitude begins replacing entitlement. Instead of assuming another sunrise is guaranteed, you begin appreciating the one unfolding before your eyes. Instead of postponing meaningful conversations, you have them now. Instead of waiting for the perfect time to tell someone they're important to you, you understand that perfection has never been part of life's design. Impermanence stops feeling like a threat. It becomes an invitation. Psychologists have discovered something fascinating about human attention. We naturally adapt to almost everything. The house you once dreamed of eventually becomes ordinary. The new car loses its excitement. The salary increase becomes your new normal. Even extraordinary experiences slowly fade into routine. This process is known as hedonic adaptation. But you don't need scientific terminology to recognize it. You've lived it. Remember something you desperately wanted years ago. Perhaps you believed that once you achieved it, everything would finally feel complete. Then you reached it. For a little while, life felt different. Then the mind quietly moved the finish line again. Another goal appeared. Another desire. Another version of yourself that still needed improving. The chase continued. Buddhism recognized this cycle more than 2,000 years before modern psychology gave it a name. Desire itself isn't the enemy. Attachment is. There's nothing wrong with having dreams. The problem begins when your peace depends entirely on whether those dreams unfold exactly as planned. Because life has never followed anyone's script. Not yours, not mine, not history's. Consider Abraham Lincoln. Before becoming one of America's most respected presidents, he endured repeated political defeats, financial struggles, personal tragedy, and profound depression. At multiple points, his story looked like failure. Had his life ended early, history would remember him very differently. The meaning of events often depends on where the story ends. But while you're living it, you don't know the ending. That's what makes uncertainty so difficult. We're reading one page while desperately wanting access to the final chapter. Life refuses. It asks us to keep walking anyway. Have you ever wondered why the human mind finds unfinished stories so uncomfortable? Researchers have long observed what's called the Zeigarnik effect. Our brains tend to remember incomplete experiences more vividly than completed ones. Unanswered questions linger. Unfinished conversations replay in our minds. Relationships without closure haunt us far longer than those that ended cleanly. Perhaps that's why so many people struggle after loss. Not because every question needs an answer, but because the mind cannot tolerate open loops. It keeps searching. Searching for explanations. Matching for justice. Sometimes for decades. Yet some chapters never close the way we'd like them to. Some apologies never come. Some betrayals never make sense. Some people leave without explaining why. If your peace depends on receiving every answer, you'll spend your life waiting. Buddhist wisdom gently offers another possibility. Closure isn't always something life gives you. Sometimes it's something you create, not by pretending nothing happened, not by denying your pain, but by refusing to let unanswered questions become the center of your identity. There's remarkable freedom in saying, I may never understand this completely, and I choose to keep living anyway. That isn't surrender, it's maturity. It's the recognition that uncertainty is not a flaw in reality. It's part of reality. Perhaps nowhere is this more obvious than in our relationship with death. Modern culture works tirelessly to keep death out of sight. We celebrate youth. We avoid conversations about mortality. We act as though life stretches endlessly ahead, even while knowing it doesn't. Ancient Buddhist practitioners often did the opposite. They reflected on mortality regularly, not to become fearful, but to become awake. Because remembering that life ends has a strange effect. It clarifies what actually matters. Petty arguments lose their importance. Death becomes less impressive. Comparison begins to feel pointless. Love becomes urgent. Presence becomes precious. If you knew with absolute certainty that today was your final ordinary day, how many of your current worries would still deserve your attention? Probably fewer than you think. That question isn't meant to frighten you. It's meant to free you. Because so much of what consumes our emotional energy won't matter a year from now, let alone at the end of a lifetime. Yuval Noah Harari often reminds us that Homo sapiens became the dominant species, not because we were the strongest animals, but because we could cooperate through shared stories. Stories built civilizations. Stories inspired revolutions. Stories connected strangers. But stories also divided humanity. They justified wars, cried prejudice, shaped identities so rigid that people became willing to kill or die for ideas existing only inside collective imagination. The same thing happens within individual lives. The stories you tell yourself determine what you notice, what you fear, what you pursue, and ultimately who you become. Tell yourself you're permanently broken, and every setback becomes evidence. Tell yourself you're forever behind, and every success feels insufficient. Tell yourself that your worth depends on external achievement, and no accomplishment will ever feel like enough. The story becomes the lens becomes your world. This is why awareness matters so deeply. Once you realize you're listening to a story, you gain the freedom to question it. Not every thought deserves belief. Not every emotion deserves obedience. Not every fear predicts reality. The mind produces thousands of thoughts every single day. Some are wise, some are absurd, some are echoes of childhood. Some belong to other people's expectations. Some are simply habits repeating themselves. You don't have to follow everyone. Perhaps that's what inner freedom has always meant. Not controlling your thoughts. Choosing which ones deserve a home inside your heart. So, does everything happen for a reason? After walking through history, psychology, neuroscience, philosophy, and Buddhist wisdom, perhaps the answer is both simpler and deeper than we expected. Life doesn't guarantee that every tragedy carries a hidden cosmic message designed specifically for you. Sometimes earthquakes happen. Sometimes illness arrives without fairness. Sometimes kind people suffer while cruel people prosper. Reality has never promised perfect justice. But Buddhism asks a different question. Not, why did this happen? But, who will you become because it happened? That single shift changes everything. Meaning is rarely discovered like buried treasure. More often, it is created through the choices you make after life refuses to follow your plans. Every act of compassion after betrayal. Every moment of courage after fear. Every decision to remain open after heartbreak. Every refusal to let pain become hatred. Those moments are where meaning is born. Not because the suffering was necessary, but because your response transformed it into something that did not exist before. Maybe that's the quiet miracle hidden inside the phrase, everything happens for a reason. The reason isn't always waiting somewhere in the future. Sometimes you become the reason. The reason someone else believes healing is possible. The reason a child grows up feeling loved instead of abandoned.